Good evening and welcome to the GDPR webinar. We're joined tonight by Chris Norris, Director of Policy and Practice at the NLA. Thanks for joining us this evening, Chris. I'll pass you over and if you could introduce yourself.
Thanks, Polly. Yes, I'm Chris. I'm Director of the NLA. I've been with the NLA for a long time now. I've been with the organisation for about 11 years. I'm also a landlord. And for my sins, and I probably shouldn't admit it, I've been a letting agent. So a lot of this is really quite pertinent for me.
Fantastic. It's certainly pertinent for a lot of us, with every company in Europe having to deal with these changes now. So GDPR, the great data puzzle, as we're referring to it in the office. So the general outline of GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, is very similar to the Data Protection Act. There's a few changes, but the principles are by far the same. So the regulation's principles aim to ensure that the individual, in this case your tenant, has the right to be informed, so allowing individuals to know that their data is being stored, the right of access, allowing them to access their data and verify the law of processing. So processing would be whenever their data is used. So whether that would be being used for referencing or by your letting agent, even by your plumber. The right to rectification, allowing individuals to change or amend their data if it is incorrect or incomplete. So if you have their phone number and they change it, they're able to then make a change. The right to erasure, or the right to be completely forgotten, a total wipeout of their data from your systems. The right to restrict processing, so they can put a block on their data being used at all for any type of processing. The right to data portability, to obtain and reuse their own data for their own purposes across different services. The right to object, to say no to their data being used for any marketing or different types of processing. And this is quite a strange one. This is one of the biggest changes to the regulations. The title is the right to not be subject to automated decision making, including profiling, which in plain English is allowing your tenant to say no to their data being subject to analysis without human intervention. Human intervention being a computer deciding on what goes on with their data. So whether a computer decides to possibly send them an email or put them in a specific box based on their data alone. So their data could say that they're a female, aged 45, so it would send them a pink email rather than a blue one. And they can say, I don't want my data to be used in that way. So that's the main principles of GDPR, and it's ensuring that an individual has all of those rights on their data. GDPR, I'd say, is coming on May the 25th, and it is a Brexit-proof regulation. So even though it is a European regulation that's been decided by Brussels, Brexit won't make any difference. It's one of, I believe, only 3. Do you know the other regulations?
No, I don't. We're fortunate, really, in using a lot of the regulation that we work to. Although there's a root somewhere in European legislation and European policy, it's not a direct impact. So we're not massively concerned as an organisation at the NLA about lots of the impacts of Brexit. But we do get the question an awful lot from members about GDPR. GDPR is seen as European. They assume that actually I don't need to do it because there'll only be about a year of GDPR being in place before we leave the European Union. And then even if I haven't got it quite right, I'll probably be okay. Which of course is completely wrong. Not being a directive, it doesn't need to be transposed into UK law, and it has effect from the 25th of May.
So Chris, one of the questions that we get asked a lot, and I think we've been talking before, and you've said you get in on the advice line quite a lot, is what exactly, we understand that data is an important element and it needs to be considered, but what exactly qualifies as data? Presumably name and address, but is there anything else that we need to be considering when we're moving forward with managing GDPR?
I mean, you're right. The crucial question is what is personal information or what is personal data? And there's lots of technical terms that get bandied around that really don't matter. So our advisors, day in, day out, with all of the news stories about GDPR, get asked, well, what am I really holding personal data? I don't hold all the information. fact of the matter is, as a landlord, you do. And what you need to be thinking about is how easy it would be for a third party to identify someone based on the information you've got. So the most obvious is if you've got a name for that person, then yes, you know who they are, but it needn't be a name. If you've got a collection of information like addresses, phone numbers, email addresses, even bank details, which is obviously a very sensitive piece of information, dates of birth, any information either on its own or in combination with another data point that could be used to identify that person is what we're talking about with GDPR, and is what needs to be kept securely controlled because of GDPR.
And I suppose with social media and all that sort of thing, I mean, I'm just thinking I've got a Facebook page, I've got a LinkedIn page. So if somebody's got purely from this webinar, people know that I work at Irvine, they know I'm the marketing director, and they know my name. So from that, I mean, there's not a lot else on my social media before anyone starts to steal my identity. But from that, they'd be able to obviously pick up. I know people are becoming quite wise to it and locking their social media accounts but if you weren't necessarily wise to that and you had an open Facebook account, say, they may be able to find out whereabouts you lived, your date of birth and all that sort of thing. So I suppose it's quite, with social media, it makes it a lot easier to track a person.
It does, and it means that you haven't got to fail to secure a lot of information for someone to be able to combine that with a public source of data to identify that individual, and as you said, to perhaps steal their identity or conduct some kind of fraud. Now, it needn't be the name, it could just be elements of their address when they moved in, their previous address. If they can use that and combine that with information on a Twitter page or into information on a Facebook account, you could build up quite a detailed picture of that person and access quite a lot of information about them.
And so as a landlord, it obviously you're holding this data, and so if your tenant, by no fault of yours, was the subject of a fraud, if you're not necessarily complying with GDPR quite as tightly as you maybe should be, if you weren't aware, or if you weren't following the procedures that I think we're going to outline moving forward, if they were then subject to a fraud, could it come back to you? Could you be held to blame for that?
Well, you could invite unnecessary questions. And whether or not you'd actually find yourself subject to an investigation because of a data breach, this hasn't come into force yet. It's a lot more stringent than the current system under the DPA, so it's not entirely clear. But it's not going to be difficult to comply with GDPR, and most of it is actually, it's common sense. So if you're holding data securely, you've got a ready-made defence against any allegation that you are part of the reason for things going wrong. And let's face it, you don't want to face the sanctions for not complying with the GDPR.
They're fairly hefty, aren't they? I mean, it's I know with the Data Protection Act, the maximum penalty's £500,000, isn't it? But GDPR is significantly more, I believe. I think it's quite a high one.
That's one way of putting it. It depends if you happen to have 20 million euros in the bank or not. I mean, to be fair to the guidelines, it's proportional. So the expectation is that there's a breach. The financial sanction that you can face is proportional to your income and to your role. So yes, the cap is 20 million euros or 4% of your worldwide turnover. I've not met many landlords in my time at the NLA who have £20 million turnovers or higher, obviously. But the more interesting bit, I think, for landlords is a secondary sanction, and that's the potential compensation. So, yes, the ICO could decide that you're in breach and they could fine you, but your tenant or the third party whose data you hold could sue you for damages. So if they've been subject to a breach and you have done something that's led to that, they could take legal action, and it would be down to a judge to determine how much harm had been created to that person, or how much damage had been done to that person, and what your role was in. And that could be, well, technically it's unlimited, that could be a very substantial sum.
So 20 million euros as a potential fine, you're probably going to want to look at complying with that then. So, I mean, right, so let's work out how you're going to have to be compliant with GDPR. So how how is this going to change things for you as a landlord? So you as a landlord are going to become a data controller.
Really are. Landlords are data controllers by virtue of what they do. Hold all information, and because most of us are small businesses, you are in control of that business and how you obtain and then how you secure that information. So I think the question that a lot of landlords ask us is, am I really involved in this? Why should I have anything to do with this? And it boils down to that as a data controller. It means you've got a lot of responsibility. And what GDPR is doing is it's moving the onus of ownership. It's empowering tenants or any third party information to make more demands, to know what's going on, for there to be some transparency, and making individual data controllers more responsible for the type of data they obtain. So a landlord is in a decent position to begin because they've got a justifiable reason to hold information. You can't establish a tenancy if you don't know who you're establishing a tenancy with, and if you've not been able to verify they're able to afford tenancy. But you've got to make sure that in every conversation you have in setting up a tenancy, you've got their consent and they understand why they're giving you particular bits of information. So that is why you're collecting the information, legal basis you've got collecting the information, and mostly that's to do with running a tenancy. It could be something like to rent, where you have a statutory reason to take the information. Exactly what items of information you need and why, and what you're planning to do. So if you're collecting 4 years worth of addresses, for instance, it's not always clear to why you might want to do that. So pointing out that you need to be able to credit check back through a period of time, for instance. And crucially, when you're doing that kind of job, are you going to do all of the data processing? So that's the active work analysis of using the data yourself, or are you going to give it to somebody else? Do you have an agent who manages the property for you? Do you have a referencing agency, some lawyers, or as we mentioned before, even a plumber who want to know your name when they knock on the door to come around and do some work? How are you going to hold that? Who are you going to get to? And ultimately, how would you destroy it if you need to, or when you need to in the future?
It's quite interesting with regards to when you would destroy the data. One of the things we get asked with regards to keeping data is how long do I need to keep it for? And I believe that the correct theory is that if you have a legal agreement with somebody, that legal agreement overrides the GDPR regulations, as it were. You're allowed to keep data, not overrides them. You should still obviously carry out the correct methods, but you're allowed to keep data to safeguard you with the legal side of things. So if you have a tenancy agreement, you can keep data for 7 years, I believe.
There's different elements. So you effectively, as long as you've got a business relationship with that person, you need some data. So as long as that's going on, hold on to the data. Occasionally refresh consent. That's a big difference with GDPR. When you're talking to your tenants, make sure they're still happy. Frankly, you should be doing that to make sure the details haven't changed. If your tenants change their phone number and you don't know, it could cause problems further down the line. So when you're doing that normal due diligence, just make sure they're happy that you still hold to that data. But you're right, there are certain legal elements. So something like right to rent, you hold on to that information for a year after the end of tenancy. Elements of data that relate more to the finances, you'll need to keep that for 6 years. Tenancy. So as long as the tenancy is going on, hold on to it, just make sure you think properly. Once the tenancy comes to an end, it depends a little bit why you've got it. But as soon as there isn't a legal reason, as soon as you might not need it for an audit, for instance, safely destroy information.
So they're your obligations as a data controller. That's your role as a landlord. I understand you have obligations or your processes, your data processes. So that would be your letting agent, your managing agent, your referencing company, anybody that handles data on your behalf. So as I understand it, you are sort of the starting block. You're the top of the data tree, as it were. And so all of the branches below you are your data processors. Anyone who then handles your tenant's data on your behalf, even down to, as we keep mentioning, your plumber. Presumably if you've got a burst water pipe, you then would pass your tenant's address, their name, potentially their phone number onto the plumber. You're passing their data on, therefore they're then handling it and should theoretically be subject to the same regulations as possible referencing company. So where do your responsibilities lie with regards to your processes? Is there anything you have to do to make sure they're compliant, or is it down to them?
Some steps you should take, and this is one of the elements that is changing a little with GDPR. Under the Data Protection Act, it's a bit more of a grey area. I object to calling it that. Under the DPA, your responsibilities don't exactly stop, but they tail off very quickly after you pass the data to a third party. It's then their responsibility to process that properly in accordance with the law. Under GDPR, it's a bit like being the boss of a company. You know, if you're the principal of that company, you've got a responsibility for what everybody under you does. You can't control every element of what they do. You can't stop an errant member of staff doing something spontaneously that would, in this case, create a breach. But you can have policies in place. So what the GDPR wants you to do is to ask the right questions of your data processors. So of that plumber that we talk about all the time, for instance, you should, when you're contracting out to that kind of service even, ask what they do, what steps they carry out to comply with GDPR, and how they'll be securely holding that information. Now, that will change business to business, because it is the situation of a burst water main, and you call up the plumber in the middle of the night. That isn't going to go into a sophisticated filing system that's under lock and key. That's probably going to go into that individual's mobile phone or book on the dashboard of his van, which is exactly what you want to try and avoid. So to make sure that you're complying, you need to ideally get a copy of the fair processing notice or privacy policy that company is using. And I think because GDPR is really so high profile at the moment, most companies will have those kind of standard documents now for you to keep on file to prove that you've done your job.
And the way here at Urban, we've obviously got a very comprehensive privacy policy outlining the way we collect data, would edit it, store it, the way we even view it, and how we would archive it, all that sort of thing, and our very clear policies and the NLA, I presume, would have a similar one. And so if one of our landlords, for example, wanted to see that, we're very happy to share it. They could then keep it on file. So when they would then instruct us, if there was ever a breach, whether it be us, whether it be Rightmove, whether it be referencing, they can say, well, look, to the best of our ability, we can only trust that all of our processes are doing what they have said they would do. And presumably that would then be sufficient for the ICO, as it were, to say, well, you can only believe that they're going to do what they say they're going to do. And I assume that would be as much as you can do.
Absolutely. And I suppose the best thing you can do is vote with your feet. On the 25th of May, there are going to be lots of small companies that probably aren't quite ready. But the more customers that turn away from our friendly plumber because it doesn't have privacy policy, the quicker they'll get one in place. And we don't expect this to be that rigorous and that costly for companies. So make sure you're dealing with compliant companies.
So one of the big elements to GDPR is having consent to collect and process an individual's data. And I understand that this has to be very carefully documented, and also there has to be a very clear withdrawal option. So even if your tenant gives you consent to use their data, you have to give an option for them to stop using their data. Is that different to how it is under the Data Protection Act, or is that something that we should be doing already?
It's clarified. I think what the Data Protection Act has done has left a lot of the actual activity up to best practice and up to discretion, really. So I think if there'd been a breach and you were holding data that you shouldn't have been, or holding data that was alleged they'd withdrawn their consent from, the onus would be on the data controller to demonstrate why they still had it. I think now, because the onus is shifting completely to empowering the individual, the rights of the individual, you've got to be a lot more careful about how you demonstrate consent. So there's lots of different ways. As you say, you can obtain consent. You can, straightforward, probably the clearest with GDPR is to have a specified consent form that explains what you're keeping, how long you'll keep it for, and all of those other things we've mentioned. They sign. But if it's online, it could be a tick box, an active tick box. That is, rather than passively, by not ticking this box, I give consent. We can't have that anymore. But opt-in buttons, yes/no options, responding specifically to an email asking for consent, and various other aspects. You've got to make sure that over the long term, over the term that you're holding data, you can demonstrate you did have consent. So it could be a conversation where you actively consent. You've got to document that, and you've got to be confident the document you've kept will actually prove that you did obtain consent in the first place.
And as I understand it, consent can't be conditional to moving forward with the tenancy. So, for example, you can't build consent into the tenancy agreement, for example. So you can't put a clause into the tenancy agreement saying I consent to you holding my data, and by signing the tenancy agreement they are therefore giving consent. So you sort of tricking them into giving consent, for example. It has to be a separate entity.
Yeah, it's got to be clear, it's got to be active. I mean, obviously, there are certain bits of data that you do need in order to go ahead with tenancy. So there are legal requirements that could make it a condition. Back to right to rent again. If you refuse to give me your immigration status, I can't legally proceed with that tenancy. But equally, I need to obtain that properly. I need to demonstrate that I got your consent to have that information. And you're right, it cannot just be embedded in tenancy in the way that quite a lot of consent in the past has been.
And so so probably the easiest way is to get an individual consent form, or maybe do it on email. And there's a few things that you probably should include on that. So your name or the name of your organisation if you're a company, and any third parties that are going to then rely on the consent. And this is quite a confusing one. Could potentially be a confusing one. As I understand it, just saying a letting agent or a referencing agency isn't enough. You have to actually name the company that is going to then be using the data.
That's right, and it's one that actually is quite confusing to those of us in the industry as well, because in practice we're not 100% certain how that's going to work. And yeah, and the plumber that we talked about all the time, you're right. So far as possible on day one, you should be listing those individuals you know you will be sharing data with. So if you do use a particular letting agent, well, let's face it, you're probably in their office for doing this, that should be listed there. If you do use a particular reference company, you've got to make very clear who that is. If you're a larger landlord of a maintenance company that you work with, that's easier. But there are going to be times when there are emergency situations. In the same way that emergencies override some of the rights to quiet enjoyment at the moment by law, emergencies will also play a role here. But you've got to do everything you can day one to make sure that you're fine. It boils down to that. You've got to tell them who you're working with, who you are, why you want the data, what you'll do with the data, and how you can draw the consent, or how you destroy data further down the line. But there will be circumstances where you can do your best to make sure you can get consent. So using the overworn plumber analogy again, if your tenant calls you up for the night and says there's water pouring through the ceiling, say, okay, I'll send a plumber around. I think it will be this company. Do I have your consent to give them your details? Now, that's not as bulletproof as getting signed notice, but you've demonstrated in the circumstances you're doing everything you can.
So although you might choose at the start of a tenancy, your general procedure is to do a written consent form, or maybe respond via email. So you've got a digital paper chain, as it were, a dated paper chain. In an emergency situation, a sort of an oral consent is okay. And let's be honest, it's very few tenants when they've got water pouring through their ceiling are going to say no to having their details passed over to a plumber. However, if they do, then obviously you can you can give them the details of the consequence of not allowing consent, and you can say, well, if you don't allow me to pass the details over, you will continue to have a wet floor in the long and the short of it. So that's how you deal with the obtaining new data. If you're starting a new tenancy, or you're looking for a new tenant, or you're moving forward with getting new data. But I'd imagine there's an awful lot of people out there with that's great if you're starting your landlord journey, but anybody who's already got tenants in place or has got a history with tenants, they've probably got an awful lot of data already on file, and I'm hazarding a guess that they possibly haven't maybe followed those consent procedures previously. So if you've got data already, and you're already holding it, you've maybe got data from 10 years ago, and those tenants are long gone. Where do you stand there? I mean, do you keep it? Do you delete it? What do you do in that situation?
I think in those situations that the principle is the same as you'd apply to new data. So you've got to go through and ask yourself lots of questions. But as you say, landlords are going to have lots and lots of information about lots of different tenancies, some of which might not have even become tenancies. There might have been applications and references. So you've got to go through and look at every single piece of information you own or you hold. Don't own it, should get that right. Every piece of information you hold, and ask yourself, do I still need it? If I do think I need it, do I have a legal justification for holding it, and do I have the consent for holding it? So, the very broad brush is look at the information. If you didn't create a tenancy from that referencing or that application, follow your deletion process, whatever you have in place, and securely dispose of that information. If you did have a reason for holding it, you say you did have a tenancy agreement some years ago, look at how long you need to hold that to make sure that you're not opening yourself up to legal problems. So if it pertains to your finances, keep hold of it for 6 years. If it pertains to right to rent, keep hold of it for a year, whatever else you might have there. And if it's to do with a live tenancy agreement, check the consents. Hopefully you've been doing things right, you've been applying common sense, and you've got an active consent for that. If not, get in touch with those tenants. Do it in a friendly way so you don't spook them as to why you're suddenly looking for more information. But make sure you use that fair processing notice or that privacy notice that you developed, and just refresh that consent.
And I'm hazarding a guess that people, GDPR obviously is coming out, say, on May the 25th, and it's going to affect every single business in Europe. So I'd imagine most people will come to hear of it at work. I'd imagine there's going to be an awful lot in the press, in the media. So is it worth, maybe with existing tenancies, holding off until maybe around that time, so people are going to be aware of it? If you're going for sort of retrospective consent to get consent on data that you've already got, maybe holding off until that time, so people are probably aware of it. They've got an idea of what's going on, so you can kind of give them a call and say, look, this is all going on. You've seen it on the news. You might be having to deal with it at work. It's a bit of a pest, but can I just pop you over a consent form, and would you mind signing it just so I can pop it in my records for you?
In an ideal world, yes. I mean, if you're a typical landlord who's got one or two properties, with a tenancy each, absolutely, that's fine. If you're a bigger going concern, if you've got dozens of tenancies or lots of different relationships with service providers, I'd say you probably do need to get started earlier. At very least, produce a plan. If questions are asked later on because that plan slipped, or maybe someone refused to give fresh consent, at least demonstrate why you were doing it in a particular way. Because you're right, people are going to become more aware closer to the time. And the last thing any landlord wants to do is really spook the tenants if there's nothing wrong.
So get prepared, get your ducks in a row with regards to your existing tenancies, and sort of get organised as soon as you can, because it's going to come up awfully quickly. I think it's creeping up on us already, but it's going to be here before we know it, I think, isn't it? So we've mentioned a couple of times privacy policies, that you have to access your processor's privacy policies, and that's something that you should make note of and probably save down and keep a copy of. But it's something that you should be preparing yourself, shouldn't you, as a data controller? And you should be writing a privacy policy that you can supply to your tenants. Now, that sounds like quite a scary thing to do. Is it?
I think it could be, or it can be, should I say. There's quite a lot of information you've got to include in a privacy notice or a fair processing notice. There's lots of different names for them, frankly. And there's a temptation to make them very legal, although the GDPR is really clear, actually, that your notice has got to be concise, it's got to be transparent, and it's got to be easily accessible. So you've got to make sure that it's written really clearly to do that. I wouldn't recommend that every landlord goes out there and tries to reinvent the wheel. I mean, at the NLA, as you'd expect, we're trying to make life easy for people. At landlords.org.uk, you can access a legally prepared generic fair processing privacy notice that you can give to your tenants. But you will need to make sure that the information entered into that is appropriate. So it's down to that and what am I doing question, really.
So to confirm, the NLA are preparing a privacy notice that will be sort of a similar to your tenancy agreement on the website that you can as a member you can download and fill in and then submit to your tenants. And as I understand it, it's best to it's recommended that you submit that separately to your tenancy agreement, rather than having it built into your tenancy agreement, so that if you need to change it at any point, if there's any, I dare say, as GDPR rolls on, as things change, there'll be changes to privacy policies that no doubt the NLA will update, but then you don't have to reissue your tenancy agreement if it changes.
That's true, but also we collect information from people we might not ever enter into a tenancy, so it's a good idea to be doing this up front. If someone applies for a tenancy in your properties, take care of the consent then. That's when you're taking the information, that's when you're going to be doing lots of processing, when you're going to be referencing and checking people's background. So do it completely separately, make sure it's clear so people understand they're signing that, not a tenancy agreement. And then, as you say, you're able to amend that and make sure that you remain compliant in the future.
Brilliant. So to confirm, there's a privacy policy available on the NLA website at landlords.org.uk, and just pop in the search bar GDPR and there'll be a wealth of information and the downloadable template for members. Perfect. So all of this ultimately is to protect you from well, not protect you, but to prepare you for handling a data breach, really, isn't it? So if worst case scenario, one of your tenants was subject to a data breach, or someone whose data you held was subject to a data breach, if you've done everything that we've discussed tonight and you followed the procedures and you've got everything in place, you're then safe, as it were. You've ticked all the boxes, you've done everything correctly. But if one of your tenants came to you and said, my data's been breached, I've been subject to a fraud or something, and they're pointing the finger, as it were, at you, thinking that it might have been something that you've done or one of the processes that you've engaged has done, what do you have to do? Is there a process procedure that you need to follow to
There is, although to what extent you're actually able to make it right is probably questionable. Once there's been a breach, the information's out there, and particularly with the internet and with the ways that things can be shared so easily, it's unlikely that you can bring that back and secure it afterwards. There's different ways this might happen. If, as you say, a tenant comes to you and says there's been fraud, and they suspect that your policies or your process is partly responsible, check. Has there been some kind of breach? Has your system been hacked, which sounds very grandiose, but is your Wi-Fi not secured, for instance, which it should be as part of your policy? Have you lost a data stick that contained lots of information? Have you been burgled and your laptop's been taken? All of those things are breaches, and they are breaches that you should follow certain steps. So you need to, the ICO will tell you first have to try to recover that information. Suspect if you've been mugged and your phone's been taken, you're probably not going to get that back, and that genie's already out of the bottle. But you've got to look at containment. That will be reporting it to the police, reporting it to your mobile provider if it's a phone, for instance, to make sure that's blocked and people can access the information. You've got to assess whether there's a risk in the future. Now, hopefully the information you're holding is held securely. You put the password on on your phone, or your biometrics involved, so it's more difficult for them to access. And you've got to look at who you need to notify. Now, GDPR says you've got to notify the ICO if there's been a breach, and you've got to demonstrate what you've done. The other type of breach that might have occurred, your tenant might not know about. If you've been burgled, for instance, there's no reason your tenant will know that laptop's been taken. And you've got to make a decision about whether it's in their interest to inform them. So if it's bank details, for instance, there's a very clear reason for notifying that tenant that the information has been stolen, so they can talk to their bank and block any potential fraud. If it's another, let's say, less useful piece of information to a fraudster, if there's no remedial action they can take, it might not be in their interest to be told about that, but you do need to report it to the ICO, and you do need to follow any steps that they then suggest that you follow.
Talking about the ICO, one of the really important things to discuss tonight is being a member of the ICO, which I think is something that comes as a bit of a surprise to people. So the ICO, being the Information Commissioner's Office, is actually a legal requirement, I believe, to be a member of the ICO, isn't it? And it's, as a landlord, it's, well, as a business, it's a legal requirement. And for a landlord, I think the cost is, well, for an independent landlord with a couple of properties, the cost has just gone up from £35 a year to £40 a year, just in time for GDPR, which is handy. But yeah, it's £40 a year to be a member of the ICO, and it is actually a requirement under GDPR, I believe.
I believe so. Unfortunately, the ICO themselves haven't always been that helpful in confirming to landlords that they need to be registered. I mean, our recommendation is, even if you've got any doubt, for £40 for a year, register. You're saving yourself any questions, and you've got a direct line then to the people who actually know how this is supposed to be implemented. They'll send you updates when things change. I mean, the NLA will do that as well, but why not receive it twice? But for £40, that's then tax deductible, just register.
So I think we're getting there. I think everyone's thoroughly panicking now, so hopefully we've not scared anyone too much. We're getting loads of questions in. We'll just run through a few of them. Now, one of the ones we're getting in quite regularly, and we certainly hear a lot, is, do these regulations apply to my tenants as well? Presumably it's the answer would be no, because your tenants aren't a business, and it's they're obviously the GDPR regulations are purely for businesses. But can you clarify that for me?
You're absolutely right. GDPR applies to businesses. Landlords are businesses, even though people don't always recognise us as such, and therefore you've got to comply. Your tenant, and we get a similar question. Landlords call up our advice line and they say, well, I'm also giving my home address and my name and my bank details because I want the rent to be paid by standing order to these tenants. Where's my privacy notice? And the fact is, they're not a business. Be careful with your information, but you've got a higher level of or duty of care to those tenants than they have to you.
It's frustrating, but I would say if you want your rent, unfortunately, you do have to pass certain details over. Another question we're getting in is along the similar lines. Is this legislation just aimed at landlords? I mean, it might feel like it's another thing that people are having to do, but ultimately this is a European-wide legislation. So whilst it may feel that this is something that another thing that you have to be dealing with, actually, it's not just you. It's every business in Europe, whether it's Starbucks, the independent landlord, or any business, that everybody is having to do it. So don't panic. It's not just you guys. It is everybody. Another question we're getting regularly is, do I have to get retrospective consent? So if you've got current tenants in, is this something you absolutely have to do?
Not in every single case, no, but it does depend how you obtain consent in the first place, and whether you think anything might have changed during the course of the tenancy agreement. So if you've had a tenant in place for a year, 2 years, however long it may be, and you had a really clear, common sense, documented process for obtaining that consent, then no, there's probably nothing you needed to do. If, like most people, you were probably a little bit less formal about this prior to GDPR, then it's probably a good idea to go out and make sure that you have that consent. And it needn't be an onerous task. You can go back and just confirm that their details haven't changed. Make it clear you're just doing your due diligence, and as a consequence of that, obtain refreshed consent.
We've just had a question come in on chat, I understand, asking, somebody said that their details have been, their personal address details have been made public through their licensing, and asked how that's been allowed. Can you shed some light? I'm assuming it's going to be about a business case again, but just to confirm.
I can, and we get this an awful lot, and I can sympathise because if you particularly if you're an HMO land, this tends to be larger HMOs than mandatory HMO register. Every local authority has a statutory duty to produce a register, and it has to be publicly accessible. But there are different ways they go about doing it. So traditionally, if you go back more than 10 years now to the beginning of the schemes, quite often it was a ledger that you had to physically go along to the town hall to see. Then they became they became elements of the website, and they're a lot more accessible to the public. Landlords ask a lot, how come my personal information is on there? And the answer is technically it's not. It's your business information. And if you use your personal home address as your address for the service of notices, for correspondence with your tenants, you're also making that your business address. So I can completely understand why people are shocked when they see that on a register and why they feel it's unfair. And you have the option of registering a business address. But if you choose not to, we have to realise that business address is going to be public, and they have a legal right to do it irrespective of the DPA or GDPR.
And a couple of people have asked now if all the details that they need are available after the webinar. Yes, we'll be popping up we're making a recording. I think Dan is working hard in the background recording this, and so we'll pop the recording up. It will go up on the NLA website, up on the Landlord University website, along with the slides, and there's plenty of information up on the NLA website as well, along with the privacy policy that we discussed earlier. So there's plenty of information, and also on the ICO website, if you're confused, they've got a great chat function as well. So if you've got any specific questions that we haven't covered tonight about your exact circumstances or anything, just do pop on there, and they've got a great team on the other end of the phone or on their chat function that they'll be able to help you with any specific questions that you might have if we haven't covered them. So just doing a top line getting ready checklist, because I think everybody sort of wants to hear the sort of the points that they need to cover just to get ready. We've got about a month and a half really now before it gets into place. So what can we get done in a month and a half? If I pass over to Chris, he can run through his top points on how to get this sorted in the time we've got left.
Sure. I mean, don't panic to begin with. You really don't need to panic. There's a few simple steps. Create that privacy policy we're talking about. And as we've mentioned a couple of times, you can get a lot of that information straight from landlords.org.uk. We've done the hard work for you. Review the process. Think about how you ask for that consent from your customers. Make sure there's a clear process for what you do with that information once you've got it. Store it securely, and make sure you know and you can demonstrate how you're going to delete data. When it comes to everything you've already got in your filing cabinet on your PC, audit what you've got. If you don't need it, destroy it. If you need it, but you're not sure if you've got the current consent, refresh that. And contact everyone that you work with. So if you've got a data processor, if you've got a referencing agency, if that plumber that we keep blaming for everything is going to be a regular business contact of yours, check what their policy is. Make sure you can document it. And finally, possibly most importantly, go to the ICO's website, register. It doesn't take, and it's not very expensive.
Make it sound so easy, don't we? It's those 6 easy points, and they're not complicated. They're quite simple, and I say between the ICO, the NLA, and hopefully us and the Landlord University, we can make it as simple as possible to get you GDPR ready. So I hope that's been useful. Thank you very much, Chris, for joining us tonight. That's been really useful information. I hope we haven't bombarded you too much with questions. And yeah, we'll get this all up on the Landlord University tomorrow and the NLA website. And I hope you'll join us again for the next one.